Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 84 for the week ending January 12th, 2018, the Playoffs Are Here edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I take a look at some of the top compliance stories over the past week. We ask the question, does free speech still exist at the office? Based upon an article by Ben DiPietro in the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal. Jonathan Marks asks if fraudsters are like the rich, i.e. different than the rest of us, and explores in his Board of Fraud blog. Rick Chapman writes about managing third parties in a mature compliance program from the FCCE Blog. A professor from Japan, Joseph Pazsgai, explores the question of a unified theory of corruption in the FCPA Blog. Mike Volkov gives us 5 top compliance predictions for 2018. The Feds raid 7-Eleven looking for criminals, i.e. undocumented workers. What does it mean for the compliance professional? An article in GIR explores the question, is there real or perceived bias in the monitorship process? We discuss Sherman and Sterling's annual FCPA report, highlighting recent trends and patterns in the enforcement of the FCPA. I discuss my 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance program running in January. Also, my next masterclass, I'm pleased to announce, sponsored by Markham LLP, will be held on February 11 and 12 in Markham's offices in Florida. For more information, go to my website, FCPA Compliance Report. Jay previews the Jay Rosen Weekend Report, and we preview the upcoming NFL playoffs. I know you will enjoy this episode. We had a lot of fun putting it on. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist. I'm back again for episode 84 of This Week in FCPA with my good friend, colleague, and co-host, Jay Rosen. This is for the week ending January 12th, 2018. Playoffs Are Here edition, at least for the Patriots. So, Jay, how are things in sunny California? How's the mudslide?
We've gotten through the rain and the mudslides, so unfortunately, there were some tragedies, and we're moving on, and the sun is out, and it's early for us. We normally do our podcast on Friday, and we're doing it on Thursday afternoon. So I kind of feel like we're getting ahead of the curve.
Well, if you can have Thursday night football, I don't know why you can't have Thursday afternoon recorded podcasts. So we've got actually quite a bit, so let's just hop right into it. From our good friend Ben DiPietro at the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal, he wrote a piece about the National Labor Relations Board maybe changing protected or categories of protected activity for employees, specifically in regards to codes of conduct. And I found it really interesting. I have to admit, I am a very old labor lawyer kind of guy. I have a master's in labor relations and practiced labor law in my early part of my career. So I was very interested to see that the NLRB may cut back from some of the protections that workers had in social media. And this, I found it really interesting, Jay, because they're basically saying that employees cannot be disrespectful to supervisors, management, or their companies on social media. They cannot engage in disrespectful, negative, inappropriate, or rude conduct. And that really is going to be a tricky situation. First of all, in social media, it's very difficult to control that, but it may open up companies to claims of harassment and bullying if they claim that someone who raises their hand and says, I'm being harassed, and then claim that that's a negative or disrespectful comment. It's going to be interesting to see where the NLRB goes on this. Of course, under the current administration, they're clearly anti-employee, so it's not surprising they would go in this direction. But if they're going to try to police social media and say that people can't raise their hand and make comments, and companies can fire people for making such comments, it's going to be a somewhat of a crossroads.
Definitely sounds like a slippery slope.
Next up, we had him on last week as a guest, Jonathan Marks, and on his blog site, Board and Fraud, he channeled his inner F. Scott Fitzgerald to ask the question, are fraudsters different than you and me? Of course, riffing on the question that F. Scott Fitzgerald said, or line, he said, let me tell you about the very rich. They are different than you and me. To which Ernest Hemingway replied sometimes later, yes, they have money. But he really used it to talk about, I thought, a really important point, which is, and a very important point for compliance practitioners, because fraudsters generally are different than you and I, Jay. They don't have the same internal moral compass that we have. They routinely engage in deception and cover-up. They have troubling family and friendship relationships. They are very congenial, very outgoing, very clever, can be very creative, but they just do not respond to the normal types of ethical training and ethical challenges that companies would try to put out. And I once heard, I think it was Alexandra Raggi from Trace, say that 5% of your workforce training is not going to matter for because they're basically fraudsters. So it's a very interesting paper by, it was a white paper by Jonathan that he posted on his blog. He originally wrote it for us. See if I can find the citation. I don't have that, but he originally posted it as an article. And he basically says that you have to have deterrence, which we know, but then you have to take a step further, that you have to really have an ongoing monitoring process. It's also something very important for the compliance practitioner, and then he advises to develop a response in case your deterrence fails. So for those companies out there with fraudulent characters, and unfortunately some percentage of the population is immoral, amoral, or just downright fraudsters, that's something that you have to consider in your best practices compliance program, Jay.
Yeah, and he really does a good job of listing some very relevant red flags if there's transactions conducted at unusual times of day, or they're conducted more frequently than expected, or they're large round numbers. So there are some definite telltale signs of what the fraudster does. And then when he ends up, tying up the article, he talks about, the institution of effective controls and how, you can try to help mitigate these things. But I think, what you said about Alexandra is that there is that 5%, and they're the folks that you're never going to be able to get through to.
So next up, we had an article by actually a former colleague of mine, Rick Chapman. Rick and I worked together in the Halliburton Legal Department. He's now at compliance at Halliburton. And he read a very interesting article, Jay, I thought, about managing third parties more effectively. And let me set the stage and then turn it over to you. Halliburton, of course, has gone through a couple of FCPA enforcement actions, but in their 2009 action, really put in a best practices compliance program after that, robustly managing third parties. So they have the basics in place, and Rick writes from a perspective of a compliance practitioner who specifically handles third parties and in a mature compliance program. And I thought some of his insights were very good. So why don't you tell us about that, Jay?
Yeah, it's a real economical piece that he wrote, and he talks about where most issues tend to come from third parties, that while companies may have automated solutions that are there to help with the due diligence process, whether they're online questionnaires or evaluations or approval systems, with what's happening now in this cyber insecure world, a lot of people or a lot of potential third parties may be reticent about, answering these online questionnaires, or they may not be responsive to automatic reminders. So Rick talks about that although you might have all these technology and tools at your hand, you really still need to have a human touch in terms of maybe reaching out to that potential third party, letting them know that this request for information is legitimate and it's somebody who's not trying to spam them. And then also really not being so cut and dry if you get potential red flags. Sometimes a third party may have misunderstood a question and answered it in the wrong way. So, the things that Rick speaks about, and we'll link to this in the show notes, is that you need to be flexible when you're making discretionary decisions. You need to adapt your workflow over time, and you need to collaborate for greater efficiency. And that point is that there may be other units within your company who are asking third-party vendors for the same information. So if there's a way to integrate and unite these workflows, it can make it a much more efficient, process, and make it easier both for yourself for onboarding third parties, and also make it easier for the third parties to work with you.
So let me pick up on a couple of points that you raised, Jay, because I thought they were very insightful. The first one is on the personal touch. And, when I take a look at you, when I take a look at your career in business development that kind of led to the position that you're in now, I really see that personal touch. And you've had that with customers, you've had that with clients. And it's another example of what you might say is just a basic marketing tool or technique for the compliance practitioner. Because the compliance practitioner's customers or clients, they're going to be the business unit, but there also could be the third parties they have a contractual relationship with. So I thought that was a really important point. Then he talked about the flexibility needed, and he gave some really interesting examples where when information comes in that may not be correct, it may be off, it may not be fit into exactly a box, the compliance practitioner should have discretion to accept that information, but have some sort of monitoring, auditable trail, or some other mechanism to manage that risk if it truly is a risk. If it's a mistake, the compliance professional should be able to overcome that or override that. And then the collaboration part I thought was particularly important and insightful. You should have a collaboration with your business unit representative who sponsors the third party and maintains that relationship. And your business unit representative should be having an ongoing dialogue with a third party about what's expected, what they need to provide. So when they get those automated workflow emails, they won't be surprised and they won't think it's a scam. But Rick also points out the collaboration leads to greater efficiency. So for instance, if you've had a long-term relationship with a third party, or at least have gone through one full cycle where they've gone through due diligence, that's been evaluated, they've answered the questionnaire, you have a contract that you're comfortable with in place, and they have complied under the terms of the contract, and there's no issues that would come up, you may not need to send them through the full process again. He really advocates focusing on the work they're doing for you. If the due diligence needs to be updated, it can be updated. But if there are really no substantive changes, why make them go through the entire process again? So I thought those were really insightful points about having greater flexibility, yet having that flexibility within the structure of an overall compliance program that there is oversight, there's auditability, and there's accountability. So really interesting piece by Rick. Kudos for putting it in the SCCE blog. So next, Jay, we had a really interesting article in the FCPA blog, and it was by a professor from a university in Japan. The professor, his name doesn't sound Japanese, and certainly his picture did not look Japanese, but I don't want to cause any, cultural bars here, but it's a fellow named Joseph Pazsgai Alvarez, and he is a professor at the University of Tsukuba in Japan, but he has worked with the Office of the Prime Minister of Peru on matters of ethics, transparency, and access to information. And Jay, he wrote a really long piece, which is basically says there should be, he's searching for a unified theory on corruption. And I don't think we give enough weight, really, Jay, to the how academics and academicians play into the overall FCPA, overall compliance, the overall work that people like you and I do, because they lay down a theoretical framework from which solutions can be built from. And what Professor Pazsgai, I'm sure I'm butchering that name, really says is that there needs to be a more unified theory of compliance, and that by having a rule and then or a law, and people try to comply with that, he thinks that's kind of backwards, and that we need to look more at the cultural values and ethical norms and then see if the rules fit that. So I thought it was very interesting, and I really appreciated his efforts. I'm not sure you can get a unifying theory of all of this, and maybe it doesn't make sense to others, but I applaud the effort.
Yeah, it's a really great read. So if you're going to click through to the show notes, it's definitely worth your time. Next, Tom, did you want to tell us our good friend Mike Volkov has 5 major compliance predictions for 2018. What does Mike see in his crystal ball?
Yeah, so Mike's taking a look at the year in review, and now he's looking at the year forward. And I thought this was real interesting, as really everything Mike blogs and podcasts about is. So his 5 significant predictions were ethical culture is a key, and that forward-thinking companies are going to have to are already using ethics and culture as a part of their brand identification. I would say certainly we've seen the failures of that. And you name the company: Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, Uber, and we've seen how they can hurt. But Mike really takes it and flips it around to say forward-thinking companies are using these techniques to make them more money and make them perform better than non-ethical companies. Number 2. Corporate boards, and watch out for corporate boards. And obviously, shareholder activism is growing, but also, given the corporate failures and the inevitable question of where was the board, it may be that senior executives are going to be in the crosshairs of the DOJ and SEC. Next is ethics and compliance resources. Mike really has consistently talked about the need for resources to be put forward into the compliance function. That is now enshrined in the evaluation of corporate compliance programs document released in February 2017, and in the new DOJ's FCPA corporate enforcement policy. So I think companies are going to have to quit short staffing, under resourcing, and relying on outmoded technology and spreadsheets to do their compliance, or they're going to be in trouble. Next is the testing and auditing of compliance programs. Jay, if you think about this in terms of the maturity of compliance programs, your first or second year, your program, you're really implementing it. And it may not be an appropriate time to test and monitor, but as compliance programs become more mature, we're going to see more testing and auditing, and that bleeds over to third parties and distributors. The Department of Justice is now talking about this on a fair amount, and I think companies are going to have to do this. But also, it really comes from having a mature compliance program and a mature compliance regime and a mature set of third parties. We talked about Rick Chapman's article, and auditing really follows directly along the lines of what Rick talked about as well. So really interesting article by Mike, always prescient, and gives a lot of fodder for the compliance practitioner to think about.
So now I have an article from the Wall Street Journal. Immigration officials swarm 7-Elevens, issue warning to U.S. businesses. So in a coordinated effort at 98 7-Elevens on dawn at Wednesday, ICE agents, immigration agents, came in and interviewed different employees at 7-Eleven. and they arrested 21 people who were suspected of being in the country illegally. And now those people face deportation proceedings in federal immigration court. And this is a continuation of Trump administration policy. And just in terms of 7-Eleven, the company basically has most of the different stores are franchised. So 7-Eleven says that they take compliance with immigration laws seriously, and they have terminated franchise agreements of franchisees convicted of violating laws. 7-Eleven itself is owned by a Tokyo-based company called 7 & I Holding Co. So this is just, ICE said that the 7-Eleven stores were targeted as a follow-up to a 2013 investigation of several franchises of the convenience store chain that led to arrest of 9 store owners and managers on a variety of charges. During the 2017 budget year that ended in September, the agency conducted 1,360 audits of employment paperwork and made 139 criminal arrests, which is basically about 10% of those people that were audited, along with 172 administrative arrests. So the agency said the businesses were ordered to pay more than $100 million in fines. So this once again, seems to be the administration really ratcheting up the pressure on those people who are in this country illegally.
So, Jay, let me see if I can take this story in a little bit different direction, because I see this as a compliance failure. I see this with huge FCPA implications. And I have to say, I absolutely love the statement by the parent company of 7-Eleven, which was that the convenience stores are independently owned and we have nothing to do with them. We tell them to obey the law and they obey the law. We take their money and that's it. So when you have that kind of attitude, it's certainly problematic. But now, Jay, let's lay over and talk a little bit about that 2013 matter, because that was not ICE rolling in, checking paperwork. That was a series of 7-Eleven stores, over 40 stores, were engaging in human trafficking. And they had, in addition to having illegal immigrants and not just having illegal immigrants, but had given them identities stolen from American citizens, including children and dead people. So we had basically slave labor going on in franchisee locations where they also had illegal immigrants. They had people working over 100 hours a week. And this is all in the context, Jay, of a franchise business relationship. So what's the responsibility of a franchisor in this case? Is it to do what 7-Eleven did after the ICE raids and say, oh, that's not us, and we told them to obey the law, and if they disobey the law, we'll fire them? Well, but, we'll take their money. And by the way, have you gotten your franchise fee to me this month? And if that's really the case, what's the responsibility of a franchisor? Do they have to audit? Do they have to monitor? Do they have to have some sort of ongoing program, much along the lines of what Rick Chapman talked about in third parties? What about for 7-Eleven stores overseas? Do they have a robust FCPA compliance program in place? So we have a franchisor who absolutely had knowledge that franchisees were engaging in slave labor, were engaging in having illegal immigrants and undocumented workers working in their stores. We had evidence that franchisees were engaging in identity theft. So what is the franchisor doing about all that? Now, none of those questions were answered, and indeed they weren't even posed in the Wall Street Journal article. But I really think that there's something else that 7-Eleven and indeed all franchisors need to take away from this and think about it in terms of a corporate liability or franchisor liability perspective.
Certainly interesting thoughts, and something that we'll hopefully follow up on and get some clarity. The next piece we have is from anti-corruption. part of the website. And the article is by Dylan Toker, and it's about bias in monitorship selections has become a self-perpetuating. Critics about how monitor selection should work differently. Former candidates have privately expressed gripes about a vetting process that in their eyes amounts to secure entry to an exclusive club. Their grievances concern an internal debate about who is best qualified to serve as a monitor. Is it a well-reputed criminal defense attorney or a career compliance professional with more extensive experience designing the types of compliance programs that keep companies from becoming repeat offenders? And most practitioners in the Justice Department, too, will say that both sets can be useful and that one may be more important than the other depending on the circumstances. But among some former monitor applicants, there's a perception that officials at the DOJ often skew towards picking defense lawyers, a large number of whom happen to be former prosecutors. Within the article, they give some different statistics, and they look at situations back in 2008. Then U.S. Attorney Chris Christie, a Republican, awarded a contract for overseeing a medical supply company to his former boss, John Ashcroft, a former Republican Attorney General. The monitorship, expected to cost as much as $52 million, led to intense scrutiny by Congress and the creation of the DOJ of a set of principles designed to prevent future conflicts of interest. Tim Dickinson, a partner at Paul Hastings, who has served as a monitor 3 times and has advised many companies on monitorships, said that there are 3 criteria that he looks for when picking monitor candidates. 1, compliance expertise. 2, credibility with Justice Department. And when possible, prior experience as a monitor. Dickinson says that the most important criteria is compliance expertise. He likes to see a list of potential candidates that include, first and foremost, lawyers who have lots of experience on compliance, not solely with white-collar defense. So while they may be very good lawyers, many white-collar specialists don't have sufficient experience advising on compliance programs, said Dickinson. The skill set needed for an investigation and those who develop a good compliance program are certainly not the same. And then just a couple more quotes I wanted to share with you. There is a document that was written back in 2009 called the Morford Memo after the then Attorney General. And basically it lays out what is, what are the minimums that you should have to have somebody be an efficient monitor. And it says, while attorneys, including but not limited to former government attorneys, may have certain skills that qualify them to function effectively as a monitor, other individuals such as accountants, technical or scientific experts, and compliance experts may have the skills that are more appropriate to the task contemplated in a given agreement, the memo says. But it's possible that changes are on the horizon. Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, said in a speech in October that his office is reviewing practices concerning corporate monitors. So that's something that usually comes up on my radar. Any thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah. First of all, who do you work for?
Affiliated Monitors.
All right. So there was one other point that I thought was interesting that I really had not fully appreciated, and it goes to the self-perpetuating nature of this. And it's a step beyond what you said, Jay, which is that companies think they need to have an ex-DOJ lawyer. And then let me lay one other factor on, which is that companies are allowing their investigative FCPA counsel to guide them in the decision on the monitors, if not tell them who to take. And there you have the white-collar defense bar, largely ex-Department of Justice lawyers, advising to hire other white-collar lawyers. And they're not really looking at qualified compliance professionals and compliance experts. So it's really, I even saw two more steps, and I thought really the thoughts of Wei Chin in that article brought that home. That companies are kind of falling into this conventional wisdom when it really is not conventional wisdom and doesn't need to be done. And having a white collar defense lawyer, I guess from my perspective, is it's certainly appropriate to have a prosecutorial mindset, which is something that I don't have. I always practice on the civil side of things. But if your goal in a monitor is to help the company implement what's in the resolution documents, whether that be a deferred prosecution agreement, non-prosecution agreement, or a declination, then you need to have a compliance professional. You need to have someone who knows how to design, create, implement, or enhance a compliance program inside of an organization and not simply prosecute or defend cases. So it's really becoming more and more really a self-fulfilling prophecy from all sides. That's what my takeaway was.
So next up, we have one of our treats that we get to read every year. Sherman and Sterling have released their annual report, Recent Trends and Patterns in the Enforcement of the FCPA. And any takeaways that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, they had quite a few takeaways, and I'll just hit some of the highlights. And if there are things that you want to particularly go into, we certainly can. There were 13 corporate enforcement actions, 6 of which were announced prior to the new administration, with total sanctions of approximately $1.95 billion. Not as big, obviously, as 2016, but the second largest dollar-wise of all time. The Tilia and Keppel enforcement actions were certainly very large, 2 of the top 10 FCPA enforcement actions of all time. Nearly half of the 2017 enforcement actions involved Latin America, while only 1 came from China, which is a very sharp drop. The Rolls-Royce case had both corporate and individual defendant enforcement actions, which showed how the Department of Justice could use the jurisdictional hooks it has at its disposal. We had a Supreme Court decision in the Kokesh case, which has the potential to dramatically alter the way SEC brings FCPA enforcement actions. 2 of the year's enforcement actions have arose out of breached DPAs, and that's the first time we'd seen that large a number in quite some time. We had the announcement of the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy in November, and kind of ending on the note, which is something that we have, I think, consistently said on this podcast. You've consistently said in your writings. The Everything Compliance podcast gang have said, which is 1 year into the Trump administration, it's clear that active enforcement of the FCPA will continue, and the prosecutorial staff of the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission will continue to exercise their own discretion. So perhaps some clarification, perhaps some cutback. Nevertheless, a pretty robust year of enforcement, particularly when you consider dollar-wise, it's number 2. So as always, a great report. And what were sort of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you pretty much hit them all on the nose, Tom. I think the other thing, and the cautionary note about only time will tell whether the results in the U.S. pulling back its FCPA enforcement activity and deferring more to local regulators, while also making sure not to pile on the penalties. So we've seen a lot of the global resolutions this year, Tilia, Odebrecht, and some of the others, where there's not only been cooperation, from the investigative side, but there's also been situations where the fees and disgorgement money actually goes to the locale where the corruption occurred. So there is that potential chance that as more and more of this cooperation happens around the globe, potentially the U.S. could pull back in its enforcement and allow those global regulators to step in. But right now, it seems like everyone's playing in the sandbox and sharing and playing the game the right way.
So, Jay, I am continuing my January 31 Days to a More Effective Compliance Program series. Today we had day 11, which happily coincided with January 11th, so I can remember that. It's been a rousing success. I've had a lot of fun doing it. And I have announced my next master class, which is going to be sponsored by Markham LLP. And it's going to be held on February 11 and 12 in Markham's offices in Miami. If you'd like more information on registration, it's on my website, the FCPA Compliance Report. If you're in South Florida or indeed anywhere else in the U.S., I hope you'll join us for a fabulous master class I'm going to put on with Jonathan Marks. Do we have a Jay Rosen weekend report?
We do. I'm going to share my thoughts on the new FCPA corporate enforcement policy that was recently, affirmed and put in place. So we'll take a look. It's a very focused document from Rod Rosenstein, and it really talks. It really again puts some bright lines in terms of what type of practice will be rewarded, what type of assurance businesses can have moving forward if they self-report. And then, one of the things that has been promulgated now is that if they do self-report, the expectation is that they will get a declination. So it's the DOJ continuing to think of ways to incentivize people, or rather corporations, to self-report any significant malfeasance. So, I hope it sounds as interesting as I made it sound. We'll see what comes out when we publish over the weekend.
And finally, Jay, to the most important part of the podcast, we have the Patriots back in action. After a week off, Tom Brady's letting his 40-year-old body heal up, and we have 4 playoff games this weekend. So I'm going to roll through these and kind of get your predictions. So first up, we have the Patriots at home with the Titans. And at this point, the Patriots are a 13.5-point favorite. So I assume you're feeling pretty confident about that one.
Yeah, especially since we have another New England conspiracy theory that hit the press about a week ago. So it's allowed the Patriots to have a common enemy to fight against now, which I don't know. I guess it's ESPN, and they always make a good enemy. So I think the 13.5 points is pretty high. I say it's a closer game, and they're really going to have to work on containing Mariota, and if they're able to do that, they will win that game and go on to the conference final against the Steelers.
Well, Jay, I thought you were going to release some inside information there that the Patriots actually planted that story. Belichick planted it so that he could get somebody he could fight against and turn against, and that it was a much, much, much deeper, moley type of conspiracy than even you chowderheads normally come up with. In the other AFC game, Jay, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars. They have quarterback with more running yards than passing yards in their first playoff game at Pittsburgh. They're 7-point underdogs, but we should note for the record that Jacksonville actually beat Pittsburgh in the regular season in Heinz Field in Pittsburgh. So with that added bit of knowledge, does it make any difference in this game?
I think you never really know which Steelers team is going to show up. So I think, the defense, Jacksonville is going to play them pretty tight. So it's going to be up to either the running game or the passing game. And I think what happened in that last loss, didn't Big Ben throw something like 4 interceptions in the second half? So I think Roethlisberger is going to have a chip on his shoulder and want to prove that was a fluke. So I think that's going to be what brings Pittsburgh over the hump.
So you're thinking go ahead and take Pittsburgh and give the points?
Yep.
Next up, we have Drew Brees with the New Orleans Saints at Minnesota. Minnesota's a 5-point favorite. I found this line, frankly, a little bit high. But what were your thoughts on this?
I'm waiting for Case Keenan to have his ability catch up with who he is. And, for the most part of his career, he's been a journeyman quarterback. But, sometimes they rise up and have a great season. If you look at the Ravens several years ago and, what's his name? Who's the quarterback who ended up winning the Super Bowl? He's now used to be an analyst on ESPN. So he kind of came out of nowhere. So I don't know. I think Minnesota has the defense, and I think it will be a very exciting game. And at the end of the day, I say let's go with the Boilermakers' former quarterback, Drew Brees.
All right. So in the final game, we actually have a home underdog. We have the number 1 seed in the NFC, the Philadelphia Eagles, at home against Atlanta, and they're 3-point underdogs. Now, that, of course, is largely because Carson Wentz was injured, and now Nick Foles is the quarterback. Atlanta went into Los Angeles and just stumped the Rams, who had the second best record in the NFC. So that's got to count for something. Perhaps the Rams are peaking at the right time. We can certainly say they have Super Bowl experience, and they may have a very large chip on their shoulder. What are your thoughts on that game, Jay?
I think the fact that Philadelphia are dogs at home really speaks to the lack of them not having a competent backup quarterback in Nick Foles. So I think the Hungry Falcons come in and they win.
Wow. Okay, well, Jonathan Marks actually is going the other way on this one, so we'll have to see how that plays out.
What's his reasoning besides just being a Eagles homer?
Do you need a reason more than that?
Probably not, but I thought since he writes such great blogs and he was on the show last week, I thought he might have some kind of a theory as well.
Just insight. So
okay.
With that, Jay, you want to take us home?
Sure. So on behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us early on a Thursday edition of This Week in FCPA. The playoffs are here, parenthetical, for the Patriots. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend. Enjoy the football.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA, the only weekly wrap-up of all things FCPA and compliance related in the podcast world. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about this most unique podcast. Also, if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. Thanks again for listening this week. I hope you'll join us again next week, where we explore the week's comings and goings in FCPA, compliance, and ethics. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.